I'll now turn the meeting over to our moderator, who this afternoon is a very familiar figure to all people here at the rally. He is the representative of the John Birch Society in Washington, one of two stationed there. He's an extremely able speaker. He covers the country regularly, speaking on behalf of the society. He did a great deal of campaigning politically at one time, particularly when his father was active in politics. And Reed Benson has been a tremendous help to the whole conservative cause. And so we're always delighted to have him here, and particularly to have him up here as a moderator. Reed?
Well, I'm grateful for the privilege of being here today and for the opportunity to introduce John Rouselout, who's a member of the John Birch Society and who belongs to a group some have called the St. John's Society in Congress. That's John Ashbrook, John Rarick, John Schmitz, and John Rouselout. Now let me tell you just a few things about John. I'm sure some of you know these things that I'll mention and even more, but I think it's good to have it on the record and on the tape here, and so that you'll be a little better acquainted with him. He's a graduate, a college graduate in political science and in business administration. He's married to the former Marilyn Cooper. They have 3 children, Craig, Robin, and Wendy. He's had his own public relations consulting firm, and prior to returning to Congress, this last time was a management consultant in the fields of marketing and management systems and governmental relations and general corporate reorganization and merger. I first saw John a number of years ago at a National Young Republican Convention in Washington, D.C. He was president of the California Young Republicans. He was vice chairman of the Los Angeles County Republican Central Committee and a member of the executive committee of the Republican State Central Committee. Now, John has met the enemy in various ways in at least over 100 public debates as he met his opposition. He's had over 500 public speeches, which he's made. In Pasadena, the Junior Chamber of Commerce honored him as their Man of the Year, and he has an honorary life membership in the Yale Political Union. Now, he was first elected to the House of Representatives in 1961 to 1963. And you remember that was the year shortly after his election of the great attack and smear on the John Birch Society. Then in a special election on June 30th, 1970, he was reelected. He was elected, and then he was reelected in November of 1970 for a full term. He now serves on the Banking and Currency Committee and the Post Office and Civil Service Committee. Now, most of us came to know him and appreciate him during the 4.5 years he served as the National Director of Public Relations for the John Birch Society. He's been a life member of the John Birch Society. Now, let me tell you one or two little interesting things about John, some of the experiences that he's had. John is an articulate spokesman for our side. And he's smart, and it's nice to have one of the smart guys on our side. I've heard a lot of stories about John, and I assume probably most of them are true pertaining to his ability. Now, I'll tell you one that I heard and one that I was a participant of. A number of years ago, he was participating in a debate with Dr. John Bennett of the Union Theological College, a rather liberal institution, as some of you probably know. And in this television debate, Dr. Bennett was telling about how the House Committee on Un-American Activities had maligned various individuals, ruined their reputations, difficult for those men to get work, and the number of untruths that had been said about them, etc. Well, John said, "Really?" Now, this is when he was in Congress the first time. He said, "Really? Tell me who they are." Well, as I recall, Mr. Bennett went on and said, "Well, there's a number of them. Just a number of them. You could mention any number of them." John said, "Well, just tell me a few." Well, he says it's not difficult to determine. It's happened to various individuals. John says, name one. Now, this was on the Susskind program, and Susskind is not known as a conservative, and he could see that one of his friends was in difficulty, I think. And so he turned to John, he says, I'm sorry, Congressman. He says, we've got to take a break now for, one of those breaks. And this is typical Rouselout. He turned to David Susskind, he says, Mr. Susskind, there might be a reputation of an innocent man at stake here. Now, he says, I'm a member of Congress. And he says, there might be something I can do to rectify that problem if that's what's happened. So for the sake of this individual, Mr. Susskind, would you mind waiting for just a minute so we can get right to that? Now, would you name one? And do you know what? He couldn't name one. And so after he flustered and flubbered, finally John Rouselout turned to David and said, okay, you can go ahead with the break, Mr. Susskind. Boy, that's sharp. Well, you wish you were that sharp. Anybody that's been on the road and had to face these television cameras, etc. Well, now let me tell you one that I was a part of. A few years ago, we had John Rouselout come at the University of Utah when I was the coordinator out there and have a debate with a member of the faculty out there. Now, as you know, out in Utah, we've got Latter-day Saints and we've got Latter-day Aints, and this was what some might have put in that category. Well, John did a brilliant job, and when the debate was over, there was a number of people that gathered around him to ask him questions, etc. Now, one of the things when you're on these radio programs or television programs is where somebody calls in to you and says, well, a local member of the Birch Society did this in my community or that, and you don't know whether the guy on the other end is telling you the truth or not. Whether he's just setting you up, whether he's trying to embarrass you, what it is. Well, when the debate was over and they gathered around, John did an excellent job, and a number of people gathered around, and some fellow came up and said, you told me that anybody's welcome to a meeting of the Birch Society, etc. And he says, that's not true. Why, he said, I went to a meeting of the John Birch Society in this area, and Reed Benson threw me out. Well, I was standing right next to the guy, and John wouldn't let this pass. He says, you mean to tell me that Reed Benson threw you out of that meeting? Man says, that's right. He did. Now, John looked at me, and I gave him the old shake-off signal. I said, no, sir. Now, John wouldn't let it die there. He says, Reed Benson threw you. Do you know Reed Benson when you see him? Oh, he says, I sure do. You bet. I know him when I see him. Well, he says, I tell you, he says, well, that fellow that's standing next to me, would you show me in comparison to him how tall he is? That was me. I was standing next to him. So the guy turned around to me and he put his hand over my head like this. He says he's about that tall. John Rouselout says, want you to meet Reed Benson. Well, you couldn't see that guy for dust. Now, I'll tell you, it's nice to have one of the sharp guys on our side. I'll tell you, it really is. And you know, today when Scott Stanley was referring to my good associate, Bob Lee, down here and implying polygamy, etc., I couldn't help but think of one of those more, you always wish you had the right answers. I couldn't help but think of one of those Mormon missionaries that just got out in the mission field, and he was giving a public speech there in Hyde Park, Speaker's Corner, where members of Parliament, anybody else that wants to stand on a little podium can speak. And in the middle of his talk, there was an old heckler in the back of the audience, and he yelled out, and he says, hey, brother, how many wives did Brigham Young have? And the missionary gulped. He just got out in the mission field. He says, gosh, he says, I don't know. But if I get to heaven, I'll ask him. And the old heckler says, listen, brother, Brigham Young didn't go to heaven. He said, okay, then you ask him. Now, I'll tell you, whenever the truth is given equal time, it always does well. And whenever the truth has a good spokesman, like John Rouselout, we can count our blessings. It's a privilege to introduce Congressman John Rouselout.
Reed, thank you very much. I don't know which one of us will tell the truth about the other wherever we go, but I appreciate very much your thoughts, and it is nice to have Reed Benson as a representative of the John Birch Society in Washington, because he is a very calm spokesman. He is not prone to hysteria, always has a smile and a sense of humor to go with it, and I hope that when you're in Washington, D.C., besides coming to the Capitol and asking for that tour, or a tour of the White House for those of you that want to see Mr. Nixon, that you'll come to the John Birch Society offices in Washington, D.C., because it is nice to know that Reed and Bob Lead are there to make sure that our point of view is also represented. We thank you for the job you're doing, Reed. I also want to say quickly how appreciative I am of this New England rally. I have not been able to be here the last several times. I participated, I believe, in the first 3 rallies, but we do have 4th of July celebrations in California, and as a matter of fact, I have to get on a plane tonight to attend one Monday morning early in California, sponsored by the John Birch Society. So I think, though, it is nice to pay a tribute to Colonel Bunker and Mrs. McKinney for their persistence in seeing that each year we have an opportunity to kind of reflect on some of the important things that do make this a fine country, and we thank you both for carrying this on and making sure that we have it. I think it's especially fitting that it was decided this year to pay tribute to J. Edgar Hoover, who for many years did successfully hold the line in preventing the FBI from becoming a political arm of the White House and not fulfilling its basic function because of his persistence. And I think that it is especially a fine thing this year that we take time to do it, especially since several of the candidates for Congress have been in the forefront of those who have attacked J. Edgar Hoover for his efforts to try to preserve the concepts of patriotism and just plain loyalty to our country that he did, and that we have some countermeasure to the absolute lies that George McGovern told about J. Edgar Hoover. And so I am proud for those reasons to participate in this affair. Now, I was told that we would try to keep our messages to the point. I'm sure you've all heard that the essence of a good speech is one which has a very brief beginning, a very concise and punchy ending. You're supposed to keep the two as close together as possible. So, in conclusion, I selected as a topic, when I was asked, Oppressive Taxation, 1776 and before, and now. Because, quite honestly, the systems of taxation that we have at the federal level today are far more oppressive than anything that the King of England could devise to impose upon the American people at that time. And the Congress, the body that's supposed to be the closest to the people, and especially the House of Representatives, is probably the most lax in its constitutional responsibility to do something about it. And the reason that I wish to talk on this subject today is there is far more that you as an individual can do than you probably imagine if you will take the time to spend it with your congressman, and I mean in a persistent way, because we need you to do that, and we need you to do it now. And if we begin to do it, I believe we can, in a period of time, begin to have a weight of influence in the Congress of the United States. I am sure that here today there are people from almost every state of the Union, and you would be surprised what personal contact can do with a congressman. I am sure that you may think you've contacted your congressman many times and it's a waste of time, because I know I've talked to many of you even here this weekend, and you feel it's a hopeless cause, but I think that's beginning to come to an end for many reasons, a few of which I will discuss. And so I do hope that we can review and reflect today upon the individual responsibility that we can take to do something about the tremendously oppressive system of taxation that we have now imposed from a federal level. Before I do that, let me just briefly say that I know the frustrations of dealing with the bureaucracy at the federal level. I do it every day, fighting the battles for constituents who have been ensnared in all kinds of problems as a result of federal intervention, whether it's wage and price controls, Veterans Administration, or IRS, Social Security, or whatever. And it is a very frustrating experience. It's probably very much like the experience that the man had that took his suit out of the closet that he hadn't worn for 2 years, put it on, took a card out of his pocket that had a little ticket that turned out to be a ticket for a shoe repair shop where he'd left his shoes, and he said, "For goodness sakes, I forgot all about that. I must have left those shoes have been there for over 2 years, because I can't remember wearing that suit for 2 years." So he said, "Well, just for fun, I'll go down to see the shoe repair man and turn the ticket in." So he went into the store, rang the bell. The repairman came to the desk, and he turned over the ticket and said, "I've come for my shoes." The repairman said, "Just a moment," went into the back room with the ticket and came back out and said, "Well, I'm sorry, we still quite haven't finished. They'll be ready in a week and a half." Now, unfortunately, that's very much the feeling we get when we deal with the federal bureaucracy today, which has swelled to unbelievable proportions, is almost incomprehensible the degree to which Congress has allowed this monster to be created. And in my opinion, one of the ways to begin to cut at this monster and to reduce it to its proper size is through the efforts in Congress to reduce the size of oppressive taxation. Now, taxation supposedly under our Constitution is made necessary by legitimate public expenditure. Unfortunately, that is not the case today. Now, prior to 1776, one of the things that most greatly concerned our founding fathers was the fact that the King of England, through his representatives and his various appointed governors and tax collectors, had imposed a system of taxation on the colonies here in America, with a form of taxation that had become slightly different than what was imposed upon regular English citizens, and as a matter of fact, was highly unfair. I would like to briefly read to you, or review with you, a relatively short quotation from our Library of Congress that pretty much outlines the kind of expenditures and taxation that occurred in our colonies, and we're here today to talk about some of the concepts developed in the initial stages of our country. And this particular concept is from a booklet called Colonial Finance and how the colonies in that day exercised their form of taxation. It said that the colonial governments were of a simple type. In the early days of settlement, the support of the governor was probably the most burdensome single charge placed upon a colony. The salaries of the few executive assistants or heads of department were small, and in many instances the governor and the inferior officers were paid by fees, thus lessening the need for regular taxation. Occasionally, there was additional expenditure for the support of a colonial agent in London. The legislative sessions in the colonies themselves that were allowed were usually very short, and the payment of the members, when allowed, was not large at all. The courthouses were often handsome but never large, and there was no need for a highly organized and expensive judiciary. In times of peace, there was no local navy, not even in the shipbuilding colonies. The military burden was met for the most part by a system of locally organized militia, the expenses of which were assessed upon the individual members or upon the town or county. Nor had there been developed the class of expenditures now so common for the so-called satisfaction of humanitarian and social impulses, as for care of the sick, poor, insane, or criminals, except by the most local units of administration, which were responsible for raising the money on a self-service basis. Only in the case of the Indian War or a conflict with France, the great rival of England or the North American continent, was a heavy demand made upon the colonial treasuries. Hence, taxation, even in this case, was generally light. Now, compare that with, and those were hard times because of the Stamp Acts and other things imposed by the king. And you will recall that one of the things that incited most of the taxes were on import or export duties, and this was the system of taxation. But the Parliament and the king designed a form of a stamp taxation which was placed upon various paper, legal documents, various bills of trade, etc., and a stamp was required on these, and they had to pay for those stamps. This was such an unusual form of taxation in that time that the people living in colonial America, of course, rose up, and by various protests to the various governors and through the various legislative bodies that were then, say, the House of Burgesses or others, the protest was so loud and so extensive that the king then had to withdraw those and try other forms of taxation, which he did in other ways. But the point was that the people of that time were so conscious of the various ways that the money was spent, as well as the way it was taxed, that they took the individual responsibility to do something about it and not just complain. They went to those officials that locally presided here and made such a protest that even the King of England, who had absolute power in many cases, certainly in foreign affairs, was even forced to relent and to back away. Now, in my opinion, the reason that we are where we are today is we have not paid enough attention to the people that we locally elect to the Congress of the United States. I am tired of hearing that the president is all responsible, and make no mistake about it, he's very responsible for a lot of things that are happening. But to say that everything's going to be changed if you change the president is absolute bunk. It will not change until we change the Congress of the United States. The Congress is the one that controls the purse strings. The Congress is the one that has to appropriate the money. Even though I know the executive branch spends a lot of money it does not have the power to spend. Basically, Congress could stop the kind of expenditures that we have today at the federal level. But the reason that it does not is because not enough people pay attention to what their congressmen do, how they vote, or what they're doing in the field of expenditure. They'll tell you that they voted against this appropriation or that appropriation, but we do not look at their total record as a total body or as an individual. And in my opinion, we could definitely change the whole direction, as our founding fathers did, by just placing more pressure on the House of Representatives, which must initiate all appropriation bills and all tax bills. Now, in the early days of our country, it is true that the systems of money exchange and barter was a little more simple because, for instance, tobacco, corn, wheat, other basic products grown by the individual could be used as exchange. And we, at that time, did not have to rely on an inflated dollar, as you and I must do today, a dollar that is not worth the time and effort that we spend to earn it. But even so, the basic principles are still the same. And my belief is that there are a wide variety of areas where we can place pressure on the Congress of the United States because the obvious mistakes in appropriation are so bad and so ridiculous that we could bring about a change if we would just get at the job. Now let me be specific. Today, our income receipts at the federal level on a percentage basis are basically received from the following forms of income. The individual income tax provides just about, not quite, 40% of the dollar inflow to Washington. The second largest income producer, 26%, comes from social insurance, Social Security taxes, and other types of contributions for Medicare, 26% of the dollar. Corporation income taxes provides 14% of the dollars. Borrowing costs or income provides about 10% of the income. In other words, the debt program. Other kinds of excise taxes provide about 7% of the income, and other forms of taxes provide about 5%. So it is obvious that if we want to stop wild expenditures, the place to concentrate on with our congressmen is in individual income tax and Social Security taxes. Those are the two places where the greatest amount of income is provided, well over 50%. And if we began to cut or reduce in that area, we would begin to affect at least a reduction of the amount of dollars that would be available for expenditure. Now, I know that many of you will say, well, it doesn't matter. Even if they cut back in some of those areas, we would still go ahead with increasing the debt. But my point is, and that is probably true in some cases, but my point is that would make more individual congressmen clearly aware that they cannot get away with the kind of deceit that they are now getting away with by constantly voting for huge tax programs that provide for the money for some of the more ridiculous area of expenditure. Now let's see how that money is spent. 46% of those dollars that come in are spent in the so-called area of human resources: health, education, Social Security benefits, Office of Economic Opportunity, and the poverty programs. 46%. Now, in my opinion, and this ought to be the area of attack with a congressman, under the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, We don't have the authority to tax for those expenditures. The 10th Amendment says, the 10th Amendment clearly states that those powers not, and I'm paraphrasing, not clearly delegated to the federal government shall not be assumed by the federal government. The federal government has never passed, or the several states, constitutional amendments allowing the federal government in the field of health, education, welfare, etc. Therefore, it is unconstitutional. And on that basis alone, you remember Ralph Nader and a lot of other people have talked about the unconstitutional nature of this war, and it is an unconstitutional war. It was never declared by Congress. Therefore, I believe we can put the pressure on every congressman. Do you believe in the Constitution? The answer will be yes, usually. If you do, why are you not upholding it? And then you can go into the question of the fact that they are not upholding it every time they vote for an appropriation for health, education, welfare. Because the Constitution clearly says that the federal government does not have the power to be in that field. And that is the largest area of expenditure. And President Nixon brags that it's the largest area of expenditure. Now, the second largest area of expenditure is national defense. About 32% of our dollars go to national defense. About 32% of our dollars go to national defense. Other areas, 10% for physical resources, agricultural subsidies, natural resources, so-called environmental programs, commerce. We've heard today from Chipwood about how our Commerce Department is now financing more and more trade with the communist nations. Transportation, community development, and housing. That represents about 10%. Other governmental expenditures in the field of international affairs, so-called international finance, space research, government share of federal employees, retirement allowances, about 7%. But again I say, if we merely went to our congressmen and said to them, do you believe in the Constitution? Do you believe in the 10th? Do you believe in the 10 amendments, the original 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights? Why are you not supporting the 10th Amendment? Why are you continually voting for expenditures in a field that the Congress has no real authority to be involved in? Now, I think this will take a long time. I am not Pollyanna enough to believe you can change them overnight, but I believe it is a clear area where most people of this country overwhelmingly support that position because it's just plain common sense. And let me back it up with a specific to show you that I know what I'm talking about. In my newsletter, which goes to 180,000 households in my district, on which there was a return of 10,000, I asked the specific question: 1, do you believe that the United States should reduce federal expenditures and subsidies? Or 2, that the United States Congress should add no new programs this fiscal year? Or 3, the United States Congress should continue to raise the debt ceiling to finance these programs? 96% took the first point. 96%. Now, it's true that I have 40 John Birch Society chapters in my district, so there's obviously an educational process at work. But 96% is a substantial number. Then, following that series of questions, I gave them the opportunity to select those areas where they felt the federal government and the Congress could most logically reduce expenditures. 80% said welfare. 59% said agricultural subsidies. 55% said food stamp programs. 55% said OEO programs, Office of Economic Opportunity, that you heard described part of it from this platform today. 47% space exploration. 37% said transportation. 34% said the field of education. And even 24% said medical care and health benefits. My point is, and this same type of poll has been run in over 60 congressional districts throughout the country, and the figures, the percentages of areas to cut are not that much different. The American people, when they have a clear decision to make on the basis of simple common sense, I say will make a clear decision in the direction in which basically we are all looking and in which we're discussing now. But the problem is we are not communicating that to the guy that has the vote, the congressman in your district. And I say it's your responsibility to persist over and over again with other friends, with other people, until he gets that message. And I say it doesn't take that many people to do the job. Ralph Nader presently has about 40 to 50 people in most congressional districts on a straight voluntary basis doing his bidding and his work. Do you mean to tell me that we can't rally when the overwhelming proportion of American people on a common sense basis agree with us? That we can't rally 40 or 50 people from each congressional district in this country to begin to demand the same kind of respect as Ralph Nader, who doesn't even have the facts most of the time? I say we can, but we've got to start now. It takes persistence and it takes effort. Now, I had a lot more facts and figures that I was going to give you, but I think rather than do that, I would rather quickly, and by the way, a simple tool that you can use, and I'll be glad to send all of you a copy if you want to drop me a note, or better still ask your own congressman for it and tell him to read it before he sends it to you, is we have in Congress a joint committee on reduction of federal expenditures of the Congress of the United States. Have you ever heard of it? Walter Cronkite doesn't talk about it much. This group, headed by Congressman Mahon of Texas, made up of members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, publishes twice a year the status of the fiscal affairs of the United States. It's called the Joint Committee on Reduction of Federal Expenditures, Congress of the United States, and they call it the Budget Scorekeeping Report. And they have the status of federal expenditures and income. And just show it to your congressman, point out to him these things that I have mentioned and other things that you will be able to mention to him, and ask for it and distribute it and encourage it to be known among these 40 or 50 people that you will solicit to see your congressman, to begin to get him to reduce in these areas where there is no constitutional authority for the Congress to appropriate money. It's called the 1973 Budget Scorekeeping Report, Staff Report Number 3, Joint Committee on Reduction of Federal Expenditures, and it clearly details all the basic expenditure areas of the federal government and the money that Congress is now appropriating. What can we do specifically to move in this direction? One, I think we need more genuine meetings like this at the grassroots level, and they'll start out slow, just like this group started slow, in order to bring these kind of items to the attention of local people, kind of local town hall meetings all over this country to begin to do this again. Two, join the John Birch Society, because we need the John Birch Society to promote the concepts of truth. Thank God there has been a John Birch Society in this country. Or in my opinion, we would have been in a full-fledged dictatorship a long time ago. We're moving very rapidly in that direction. I'm not quite as optimistic. I believe we can win, but I don't really think we're winning right now. I think that's putting our head in the sand. I agree with Robert Welch, we can win. But we're going to need more effort and more activity at the local level to begin to make this thing bubble upwards. Because you're not going to change the David Rockefellers and Nelson Rockefellers and the Henry Kissinger. They're committed. We've got to make it come from the grassroots like Ralph Nader's trying to do. Number 3, E. Merrill Root spoke of the American spirit. I think we need to know what that American spirit is and then do it instead of talking about it. We need a Patrick Henry in every single community of this country. Are you willing to be it? Now, I want to tell you, it isn't fun sometimes to be just 1 or 2 or 3 votes in the House of Representatives, because you don't know what pressure is that you can get from the White House and every agency and even your own constituency that is pressed into action and galvanized into action by the Ralph Naders and the John Gardners and all the rest of the garbage distributors. But are you willing, where you are, to be a Patrick Henry of your time? And I say now's the time to do it. Start going to your city council, start going to your Board of Education, and be a voice for freedom, not just a complainer. Number 4, I think we need to demand responsible fiscal votes from each congressman in this country. And I say we can change the direction of America, because that is the legislative body at the federal level that has to come up for election every 2 years. Yes, I know, by trickery, deceit, unbelievable expenditure of money, the left wing beat John Schmitz. But he ain't dead yet. He will return. Because I went through that experience once myself. And I can tell you that there is a way to have more John Schmitz in Congress if each of us will take the time to know our congressman. If he won't respond, then work to get another one that will respond. And we can do that. Finally, we need a sense of tremendous persistence. Prayers, spiritual action, godlike action. But remember, Jesus Christ was only one when he started. But I think the time has come for each of us to assume the responsibility to change this direction. Our founding fathers didn't wait for their next door neighbor to take the stand. And if you look, as Tom Anderson has said time and time again, at the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, over half of them lost their property, had all kinds of deprivations they were put through, but they were willing to stand for principle. Now, fortunately, yet, we are not put through the kind of deprivation that our founding fathers were, and don't have to, yet. But I want to tell you, the imposition of political power that is now beginning to emanate from Washington is far more subtle, far more coercive than anything the King of England could have devised. But that is only going to change if each one of us, and I think we can do it, are willing to be a Patrick Henry of our time, and what better time of the year to rededicate and re-inspire ourselves to that mission than the 4th of July. Thank you very much.
Say one more thing. Yes, do. Take a couple of minutes. You can
Now, as to documents that you can give to your congressman, I think there's three that can be helpful. One is none dare call it conspiracy, but don't just give it to him personally, which I think is the best way to do it. Personally, hand it to him and say, I've read this. I need your thoughts on it. Can you find any factual errors in it? Because it's very disturbing. Then come back 2 or 3 weeks later and ask him what he thought of it, and keep after him to read it, because sometimes they won't. Some of them are very lazy. So you've got to persist. Now, let me show you in a different way the impact that this book can have, because it's concise and in one book form. I had a large, quote, peace group that came to call on me about 6 months ago from all the various peace organizations in my district, and I saw them, as I must, as their congressman. And they told me all the things that were wrong with the war and so forth. And I said, well, one of you has mentioned that they thought that this war was financed by a lot of the people that profit from it. I said, frankly, that's very much true. Some of the people that like to keep this war going on endlessly without either winning it or bringing it to a termination are the very people you talk about. Are you willing to listen to something I have to say? There's a book that's been published called None Dare Call It Conspiracy, and it explains who those groups are. Will you read it and come back and discuss it with me? And they've all read it. We have a meeting in 2 weeks to discuss it. And 5 of them have already come in for more literature. Now, I believe that that is a wonderful educational tool. Take it to your congressman. Give it to him personally. Second book, latest edition of American Opinion. This is the best analysis of our domestic programs and what they're doing to the country and the disaster that they're imposing upon us that I have ever seen. I went through this. I didn't read every single word, but the articles in here are the finest I have seen on the disastrous domestic programs that we have and what they're doing to us. This is a good book. Give it to every one of your congressmen. And finally, subscribe or somehow have your congressman read Review of the News. It's simple, it's punchy, it gives the news that they don't see and read other places, and get them to read it and encourage them to read it. And I say that if any congressman will read this for 1 year, he's going to be coming to you for more and more information. Get him to read this magazine. It's good, it's well done, it's concise. Don't just send it to their office. Ask them if they'll read it. Now, you're only asking them to devote 1 hour or half an hour a week to glance through this. That's a simple commitment. You can get them to make that commitment and then follow through. The wonderful thing that we have now that we did not have when I was in Congress in 61 and 62 are the educational tools to get this job done. But they're going to be no good sitting on somebody's shelf. We got to get the right people to use them, our elected officials. Thank you very much.